Have you ever given a gift with your entire soul, only to have it thrown back in your face? Imagine pouring weeks of love and hope into something, a fragile olive branch offered in a war you never wanted. Now picture offering that gift at your husband's baby shower, for his mistress. You're surrounded by smiling faces, all celebrating the life that shattered yours. You stand there, holding a simple, handmade blanket, while she unwraps a diamond-studded stroller. The room falls silent. Then comes the laugh, a cruel, cutting sound that echoes in the sudden quiet. That was Amelia's reality. But what no one, especially not the laughing mistress, knew was that a quiet guest in the corner was about to unleash a storm of justice that would change all of their lives forever. The yarn was soft, the color of a pale sunrise, a delicate blend of cream, rose, and a gentle, hopeful yellow. For 5 weeks, Amelia Thompson had let it slide through her fingers, each loop and knot a silent prayer, a meditation on a life that had fractured into a million unrecognizable pieces. Each stitch was an act of defiance against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The blanket wasn't for her. It was for a baby that wasn't hers, a child conceived in a bed of lies, a symbol of her husband Dylan's ultimate betrayal. Their marriage hadn't crumbled overnight. It was a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It started with late nights at the office, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers, clinging faintly to his suit jacket. Then came the hushed phone calls he'd take in the other room, the sudden passwords on his laptop, and the emotional distance that grew into a chasm between them. Amelia, a graphic designer with a heart too big for her own good, had tried everything. She suggested counseling, planned romantic getaways he'd cancel at the last minute, and cooked his favorite meals that would often go cold on the dining table. She loved Dylan, or at least, she loved the man he used to be, the charming, ambitious man who had quoted Shakespeare to her on their first date and promised her a lifetime of partnership. Now, that man was a ghost, replaced by a stranger who looked at her with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. The final, brutal blow came not from Dylan, but from a glossy, professionally printed invitation that arrived in their shared mailbox. It was embossed with tiny golden footprints and whimsical calligraphy. Join us in showering Isabella Rose with love as she prepares to welcome baby Carter. Isabella Rose. The name felt like acid on her tongue. A junior vice president at Dylan's firm, impossibly beautiful, relentlessly ambitious, and now the mother of his child. When Amelia confronted Dylan, the carefully constructed dam of his lies finally broke. There was no shouting, no dramatic confession, just a tired, defeated sigh. "It just happened, Amelia," he'd said, as if describing a minor traffic accident. "I was going to tell you, we can figure this out. I care about you." He didn't want a divorce, he claimed. He wanted some sort of bizarre, modern arrangement where she would quietly accept her new reality. He was still paying the mortgage on their beautiful suburban home, wasn't he? They still had their life, their history. The baby was just a complication. The invitation to the shower was the cruelest twist. It was from Dylan's own sister, Sarah, who had always been closer to Dylan's ambition than to Amelia's heart. "It's just to keep up appearances, Ames," Dylan had explained, his voice slick with practiced placation. "My whole family will be there. My grandmother, Eleanor, is flying in. It would look strange if you weren't there. It would be a scene. Please, just for a few hours. For me." Amelia should have said no. She should have packed a bag, called a lawyer, and torched the last 10 years of her life to the ground. But a small, stubborn part of her, the part that still remembered the man who quoted Shakespeare, couldn't let go entirely. And then there was his grandmother. Eleanor Thompson was the family's formidable matriarch, a woman of quiet dignity and steel-forged principles who had always shown Amelia profound kindness. The thought of Eleanor witnessing this public schism was unbearable. So, Amelia agreed, and in an act she couldn't fully explain herself, she decided to make a gift. She wouldn't buy something expensive and impersonal off a registry. That felt like surrender. Instead, she went to a small, local yarn shop and chose the softest merino wool she could find. She would knit a blanket. It would be a gift not for Isabella and not for Dylan, but for the innocent child caught in the middle of their wreckage. It was a way to channel her pain into something warm and pure. As she finished the last row of stitches, weaving in the final thread, Amelia felt a strange sense of peace. The blanket was beautiful. It was simple, honest, and made with a love that felt almost holy in its sorrow. It was everything her marriage was no longer. She folded it carefully, placed it in a simple white box tied with a satin ribbon, and prepared to walk into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a hand-knitted shield. The baby shower was held at the Willow Creek Conservatory, a sprawling glass atrium that cost more to rent for an afternoon than Amelia earned in 3 months. Sunlight streamed through the cathedral-like ceiling, illuminating tables laden with towering floral arrangements, champagne fountains, and a dessert bar that looked like a Parisian patisserie. The theme was "A Star is Born," and gold and silver star-shaped balloons floated lazily against the glass, tethered to chairs draped in white silk. It was opulent, ostentatious, and utterly cold. Amelia felt like a ghost haunting someone else's dream. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the pastel palette of the other guests. She clutched her modest white gift box, which suddenly felt flimsy and pathetic amidst the mountain of presents piled high on a designated table. There were boxes from designer boutiques, Tiffany & Co's, Gucci, Dior, each one a statement of wealth and status. Dylan found her by the entrance, planting a sterile kiss on her cheek. He looked dashing in a tailored linen suit, playing the part of the proud father-to-be with unnerving ease. "Amelia, you came." "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes scanning the room, never quite landing on hers. "It means a lot." "It's quite the event, Dylan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Isabella wanted the best," he replied, a hint of pride in his tone. And then he saw her gift. A flicker of something, annoyance, embarrassment, crossed his face before he smoothed it over. "What's that?" "A blanket. I made it," Amelia said, lifting her chin slightly. "Oh, that's nice of you, Ames. Really thoughtful." He patted her arm condescendingly before being swept away by a colleague slapping him on the back. Thoughtful. The word hung in the air, a euphemism for cheap. The guest of honor, Isabella, was holding court in the center of the room. She was breathtaking, a vision in a flowing, empire-waist gown of blush silk that accentuated her perfect baby bump. Her dark hair was styled in glamorous waves, and her smile was as bright and polished as the diamonds at her throat. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of a queen in her own court, accepting compliments and touching her belly with a proprietary air. When her eyes finally landed on Amelia, her smile didn't falter, but it sharpened, becoming a weapon. She glided over, Dylan trailing in her wake like a loyal puppy. "Amelia," Isabella purred, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I'm so glad you could make it. It's so big of you to be here. It just shows how mature everyone is being about this." The insult was clear, wrapped in a pretty bow. Amelia was the quaint, outdated first wife, graciously stepping aside. Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "Bella, let's get you some water." "In a minute, darling," she said, her eyes fixed on Amelia. "The party is just getting started." Amelia endured the next hour in a state of suspended animation. She spoke with Dylan's sister, Sarah, who chattered excitedly about the baby's nursery and Isabella's impeccable taste. She exchanged polite nods with Dylan's cousins, who offered her looks of pity that were almost worse than scorn. Through it all, she watched for Eleanor. Dylan had said she was coming, but her seat at the family table remained empty. A knot of disappointment tightened in Amelia's stomach. Eleanor's presence, her quiet strength, was the one thing she had been counting on to get through this ordeal. Finally, the time came for the gifts. Isabella sat in a large, throne-like white wicker chair, beaming as a mountain of presents was brought before her. The oohs and ahs from the crowd were a constant chorus. A sterling silver rattle from Tiffany's, a miniature, battery-powered Bentley, a cashmere layette from a French boutique. With each extravagant gift, Isabella's smile grew wider, her thanks more effusive. Amelia felt her heart sink with every ripped sheet of designer wrapping paper. Her simple, handmade offering felt more and more like an insult. She saw Dylan glance at her from across the room, a look of pleading in his eyes, as if begging her not to cause a scene. Eventually, Sarah, acting as MC, picked up the plain white box. "And this one is from Amelia," she announced, her voice a little too bright. A hush fell over the room. It was a subtle shift, but palpable. The air grew thick with curiosity and morbid anticipation. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The confrontation, the drama. Amelia's hands grew cold. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Isabella took the box, a curious, almost predatory smirk playing on her lips. She untied the ribbon with a flick of her perfectly manicured fingers and lifted the lid. Isabella lifted the soft, sunrise-colored blanket from its tissue paper nest. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were a soiled dish rag. The silence in the conservatory stretched, thin and tight, ready to snap. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant bubbling of the champagne fountain. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a blush of pure, unadulterated humiliation. She saw the intricate stitches, the product of so many lonely nights, displayed for public judgment. Isabella stared at the blanket, her head tilted. A small, disbelieving smile touched the corners of her mouth. Then, it happened. It started as a low chuckle, a breathy sound of amusement. But it quickly swelled into a full, unrestrained laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy or delight. It was a sharp, piercing sound, full of mockery and disdain. It cut through the quiet room like a shard of glass. "Oh my God," she gasped, holding the blanket out for her friends to see. Did you knit this? Is this a joke?" One of her friends, a blonde woman named Tiffany, leaned in and let out a sycophantic titter. "It looks like something my grandmother would use to line a cat bed. How rustic." The laughter spread, a contagion of cruelty. A few guests, mostly Isabella's younger, flashier friends, joined in. Others just looked down at their plates, their discomfort a tangible presence in the room. Amelia felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Every eye was on her, burning with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. She looked at Dylan, her silent plea screaming across the space between them. "Do something. Say something. Defend me." Dylan's face was a mask of conflict. He took a half step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but then he hesitated. He glanced at Isabella, then back at the sea of expectant faces, colleagues, clients, family. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose silence. He offered Amelia nothing but a weak, apologetic shrug, an expression that said, "What do you want me to do?" That single, cowardly gesture broke something inside Amelia that had been cracking for months. It was the final, definitive proof that the man she had married was gone. And the man who remained was a hollow shell, a coward governed by appearances and the will of his new partner. Isabella, emboldened by Dylan's inaction, tossed the blanket carelessly onto the growing pile of discarded wrapping paper on the floor. "Thank you, Amelia," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's a very sentimental gift. We'll be sure to find a use for it." She then immediately turned her attention to the next gift, a box from Gucci, and her laughter transformed into a squeal of genuine delight, the insult complete. The moment was over. The conversation in the room slowly resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with the residue of Amelia's public shaming. She stood frozen, rooted to the spot, the sound of Isabella's laughter echoing in her ears. She felt utterly alone, exposed and foolish. The blanket, her small offering of peace, her symbol of hope for an innocent child, had been publicly desecrated, and her husband had stood by and watched it happen. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of them. With a composure she didn't know she possessed, she turned, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked past the smiling faces, past the whispers that followed her like a shadow, and headed for the exit. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay in that gilded cage a second longer. As her hand touched the cool glass of the door, a voice, calm and clear as a bell, cut through the din. "Amelia, wait." Amelia turned. Standing just inside the entrance, having arrived so quietly that no one had noticed, was Eleanor Thompson. She was dressed in a simple but elegant tweed suit, her silver hair coiled in a neat chignon. Her face was serene, but her eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, were fixed on the scene with an expression of profound disapproval. She hadn't been late. She had been watching, and she had seen everything. Eleanor Thompson moved through the room with an unhurried grace that commanded attention without demanding it. As she walked, the chatter and forced laughter seemed to die down in her wake, replaced by a respectful, almost fearful, silence. She was not a tall woman, but she possessed an aura of authority that made her seem to tower over everyone else. This was the woman who, after her husband's death 30 years ago, had not only saved the family's lucrative construction firm, Thompson and Sons, but had tripled its value through sheer will and business acumen. She was the bedrock of the family, and her quiet word was law. She walked directly to Amelia, ignoring Dylan and Isabella, who were now watching her approach with looks of dawning apprehension. She placed a gentle, cool hand on Amelia's arm. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Don't you dare let them see you run," Eleanor said softly, her voice for Amelia's ears only. "Hold your head high. You have done nothing wrong." Then, turning her gaze to the room at large, she addressed no one in particular. "I seem to have missed the gift opening. A shame. I always find it's a moment that reveals a great deal about people." Her eyes swept over the throne-like chair, the mountain of designer boxes, and finally came to rest on the discarded, sunrise-colored blanket lying crumpled on the floor amidst torn paper and ribbons. Without a word, Eleanor walked over to the pile of trash. She bent down with a surprising agility for her age and picked up the blanket. She unfolded it, her long, elegant fingers smoothing out the wrinkles. She examined the stitches, her expression unreadable. She held it as if it were a precious artifact, her touch reverent. The silence in the room was now absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. Eleanor held the blanket up. "This is fine work," she declared, her voice resonating with a quiet power that filled the conservatory. "The tension in these stitches is perfect. The yarn is merino wool, isn't it, Amelia? And the pattern. This is a Shetland lace pattern, isn't it? The whispering grasses stitch. Very complex. Very beautiful." Amelia, stunned, could only nod. She hadn't thought anyone would notice, let alone identify the intricate pattern she'd spent hours mastering. Eleanor turned her piercing blue eyes on Isabella, who now looked less like a glowing queen and more like a petulant child caught misbehaving. "My mother taught me to knit this exact pattern when I was a girl," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "She told me that you pour a piece of your soul into every stitch, that a handmade gift is a gift of time, of patience, of love. It is a gift of something that is finite and irreplaceable, a piece of your own life." She let the words hang in the air, a devastating indictment. Then she looked at her grandson. "Dylan." Dylan flinched as if struck. "Grandmother, we didn't mean any disrespect." "Disrespect?" Eleanor's voice was laced with a chilling disappointment. "Dylan, you allowed your wife, the woman who has stood by you for a decade, the woman who carries our family name with grace and dignity, to be humiliated in a public forum. You stood by and did nothing while this child," she said, her gaze flicking dismissively toward Isabella, "mocked an act of profound kindness. That isn't a lack of respect. That is a failure of character, a failure of everything your grandfather and I tried to teach you." Isabella, regaining a sliver of her bravado, spoke up. "Now, wait just a minute. It was a joke, a simple, handmade blanket. It's hardly a tragedy." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "A simple blanket," she repeated slowly. "You stand here, surrounded by a palace of vulgar materialism, celebrating a child born of deceit, and you dare to call this simple. My dear, you wouldn't recognize true value if it was woven into the very fabric of your soul. You see price tags, you don't see worth." She folded the blanket neatly and handed it back to Amelia. "This is not for them, Amelia," she said gently. "This belongs with someone who understands what it means." With that, Eleanor turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at her grandson. Her voice was no longer angry, but filled with a sort of weary finality that was far more terrifying. "Dylan, be at my lawyer's office on Monday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Mr. Harrison is expecting you." She glanced around the stunned room. "Enjoy the rest of your party." And then she was gone, leaving a crater of stunned silence in her wake. The spell was broken. The party was over. Amelia stood there, clutching the soft wool of the blanket to her chest, feeling for the first time in a very long time that she wasn't entirely alone. The matriarch had spoken, and a storm was gathering. The weekend was a torment of silence and tension. Amelia retreated to the guest room of the house that no longer felt like hers. The hand-knitted blanket laid across the foot of the bed like a silent testament. Dylan tried to approach her several times, his face a mixture of desperation and blustering self-defense. "She's overreacting," he said of his grandmother, pacing the hallway outside Amelia's closed door. "She's from a different generation. She doesn't understand. And Isabella, she was stressed, Ames. The hormones, the pressure of the party. She didn't mean it the way it came out." Amelia didn't answer. The excuses were pathetic, insulting to her intelligence. Through the door, she simply said, "Leave me alone, Dylan." His attempts eventually ceased, replaced by the sound of his frantic, hushed phone calls from the study. He was clearly speaking to Isabella, and from the snippets Amelia overheard, the conversation was not going well. The queen of the baby shower was panicking, her gilded world suddenly threatened by the quiet disapproval of an old woman. Amelia, meanwhile, felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For months, she had been drowning in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to the wreckage of her marriage. Now the ground felt solid beneath her feet, even if it was ground she didn't recognize. Eleanor's intervention had been more than a defense. It had been a liberation. It was permission to stop fighting for something that was already dead. On Monday morning, Amelia was woken by the sound of Dylan getting ready. He was dressing in his most expensive suit, the one he wore for crucial board meetings. He looked pale and anxious. "Are you going?" he asked, seeing her standing in the doorway of the guest room. "She didn't ask for me," Amelia replied simply. "You could come," he offered, a desperate edge to his voice. "To support me. We're still a family, aren't we?" You could tell her it was all a misunderstanding. Amelia looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt nothing but a profound, aching pity. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was something that could be smoothed over, managed with the right words and a show of unity. "No, Dylan," she said, her voice firm. "I don't think I can do that." He left without another word, the sharp click of the front door echoing through the silent house. An hour later, Amelia's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Amelia Thompson?" a brisk, professional voice asked. "Yes. This is Robert Harrison, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson's attorney. Mrs. Thompson has requested your presence at our offices. She sent a car for you. It should be arriving in about 10 minutes. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. "Me? But why?" "I believe Mrs. Thompson wishes to discuss the future structuring of the Thompson Family Trust," Mr. Harrison said, his tone giving nothing away. "She felt your input would be essential." The drive to the downtown law firm of Harrison, Finch & Associates was a blur. The offices were a world of polished mahogany, thick carpets, and hushed reverence. A secretary led Amelia to a large boardroom. At the head of a long, imposing table sat Eleanor, looking as poised and immovable as a mountain. Mr. Harrison, a distinguished man in his late 60s, sat to her right, surrounded by stacks of documents. Dylan was already there, slumped in a chair on the opposite side of the table. He looked up as Amelia entered, his face a mixture of shock and betrayal. He had clearly not been informed she was coming. "Amelia," Eleanor said, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." She gestured to the chair directly to her left, a seat of honor. As Amelia sat, another person was shown into the room, Isabella. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed. The glamorous confidence from the party was gone, replaced by a raw, fearful defiance. She shot a venomous glare at Amelia before taking a seat next to Dylan, pointedly not touching him. "Now that we are all here," Mr. Harrison began, shuffling his papers, "we can proceed. Mrs. Thompson has called this meeting to announce several significant and immediate changes to the disposition of her assets and the controlling interests of the Thompson Family Trust." Dylan sat up straighter, his attention sharpening. This was the language he understood. Money. Power. "As you know, Dylan," Mr. Harrison continued, "your grandfather, the late Richard Thompson, structured the trust in such a way that your grandmother, Eleanor, retains full discretionary control as the sole trustee for her lifetime. Her decisions are final and legally binding." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," she said, her voice calm and measured. "He was a wonderful judge of character. He always said that a man's true nature is revealed not by his successes, but by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. He believed that our family's legacy was not the money we made, but the integrity with which we lived our lives." She paused, letting the words sink in. "For yours, I have watched my grandson, Dylan, enjoy the fruits of that legacy. I have watched him build a successful career on the foundation his grandfather laid, and I had hoped he had inherited not just his grandfather's business sense, but his moral compass." Her gaze fell on Dylan, and it was as cold as a winter sea. "I was wrong." Eleanor picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio from the stack in front of Mr. Harrison. She opened it, but she didn't need to look at the pages. She knew its contents by heart. "The Thompson Family Trust," she began, her voice steady and clear, "is the primary shareholder of Thompson & Sons Construction. It also controls numerous real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and various subsidiary accounts. For the past 15 years, Dylan, you have served as CEO of the company, a position granted to you by the board, with my blessing. You have drawn a generous salary and even more generous bonuses, all predicated on the assumption that you were acting as a responsible steward of this family's legacy." Dylan's face was pale. "Grandmother, whatever this is about, I can fix it. The company is performing better than ever. Our Q3 profits are projected to be record-breaking." "This isn't about profits, Dylan," Eleanor cut him off sharply. "This is about principles. The trust contains what is known as a morality clause. Your grandfather insisted upon it. It states that any beneficiary who engages in conduct that brings public disrepute, dishonor, or scandal to the Thompson name is subject to immediate and total disinheritance at the sole discretion of the trustee." "Me." Isabella let out a small, strangled gasp. Dylan looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. "Public disrepute?" Dylan stammered, his voice rising in panic. "This is a private matter. It's my life." "You made it public when you sanctioned that vulgar spectacle on Saturday," Eleanor retorted, her voice like flint. "You made it public when you allowed your wife to be humiliated in front of your family, friends, and business associates. You brought shame upon the name your grandfather worked his entire life to build, a name synonymous with integrity, loyalty, and honor, values you have clearly forgotten." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Effective as of 9 a.m. this morning, Mrs. Thompson has exercised her authority under Section 4B of the Trust Agreement. Dylan, you have been removed as a beneficiary of the Thompson Family Trust." The room was utterly silent. "Removed?" Dylan whispered, the word barely audible. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Harrison said, his tone matter of fact, "that your access to all trust funds is terminated. Your company credit cards have been cancelled. The deed to your home on Oakhaven Lane, which is owned by the trust, will be transferred out of your name. The trust will no longer be subsidizing your car lease, your club memberships, or your personal expense account." He paused, "And as the trust is the majority shareholder, Mrs. Thompson has called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon, where she will be calling for your immediate termination as CEO for cause." Dylan stared at his grandmother, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. "You're firing me. You're taking my home. You're taking everything." "I am not taking anything you rightfully earned, Dylan," Eleanor replied calmly. "Your personal savings are your own. The rest were privileges, not rights. Privileges you have proven yourself unworthy of." Isabella finally found her voice, a high-pitched shriek of fury. "You can't do this! I'm having his baby, your great-grandchild. The baby is a beneficiary." Eleanor turned her gaze to Isabella, and it was devoid of any warmth. You are correct. The child, once born, will be a beneficiary, and I will ensure the child is provided for. A separate, carefully managed fund will be established for his or her education and well-being. But let me be perfectly clear. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. Not one single dollar from that fund will ever pass through your hands. It will be administered by a third-party trustee, and the child will not have access to the principal until the age of 30. You will not profit from your part in this sordid affair. Isabella's face crumpled, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. The life of luxury, the status, the power she had grasped for, it was all evaporating before her eyes. She had won Dylan, but she had lost the prize. But Eleanor wasn't finished. This was not just about punishment, it was about justice. She turned to Amelia, whose head was spinning. She felt like a spectator at the demolition of a building she used to live in. "Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice softening completely. "For 10 years, you have been the epitome of grace. You have honored our family, and you have honored the vows Dylan so casually discarded. You have endured betrayal and humiliation with a strength I deeply admire. You are more of a Thompson than he has ever been." She slid a document across the table toward Amelia. "The morality clause allows the trustee to reallocate forfeited assets to another beneficiary who has demonstrated exemplary character. The trust was established to benefit Dylan and his lawful spouse." Amelia looked down at the paper. It was a deed transfer for the house on Oakhaven Lane, to her name, solely. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "Mr. Harrison has drawn up divorce papers. The trust will be funding your legal representation. We are prepared to offer a settlement so generous that Dylan will have no choice but to sign. It includes a 50% stake of all his personal, non-trust assets, and lifetime alimony funded directly by me, contingent on his full cooperation." She looked back at her grandson, who was now ashen-faced and shaking. "You will give her everything she asks for, Dylan. You will not fight her on a single point. You will sign the papers, and you will walk away. It is the only shred of dignity you have left to salvage." Eleanor stood up, the meeting clearly at its end. She had systematically, and with surgical precision, dismantled her grandson's life and handed the power, the security, and the future to the woman he had wronged. "I believe we are done here," she said. The surprise wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a complete and total realignment of power. The laughing mistress was left with nothing but the consequences of her choices, and the scorned wife was now the sole master of her own, very secure, future. The aftermath was not clean or simple. Life rarely is. The boardroom exploded the moment Eleanor and Mr. Harrison exited. Isabella turned on Dylan with the ferocity of a cornered animal, her voice a torrent of hissed accusations and vitriol. "You told me you were in control. You told me she was just a sentimental old woman. You've ruined me." Dylan, stripped of his power and wealth, could only sit there and take it, his face a wreck of self-pity and shock. Amelia didn't stay to watch. She signed the preliminary documents Mr. Harrison placed in front of her, thanked Eleanor with tears in her eyes, and walked out of that mahogany-panelled room into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than she had in years. The house was hers. Her future was hers. The divorce was swift and brutal. Dylan, faced with the financial guillotine his grandmother held, complied with every demand. He was a ghost in the house for the 2 weeks it took him to pack his belongings. He tried to speak to Amelia once, a desperate, last-ditch appeal. Ames, think about everything we had. Can we just throw it all away? Amelia looked at him, the stranger wearing her husband's face, and finally felt the last vestiges of love die. "You threw it away, Dylan," she said, her voice devoid of anger, filled only with a sad finality. "You threw it away for a pretty box with nothing inside." He left, and the silence he left behind was not empty, but peaceful. News of Isabella's downfall spread through their social and professional circles like wildfire. Without the Thompson money and influence propping her up, her career at the firm became untenable. She was ostracized, a pariah. Within 6 months, she had quietly resigned and moved back to her hometown to live with her parents, her dreams of a high society life in ashes. Amelia heard through the grapevine that she'd had the baby, a boy. As promised, a trust fund was waiting for him, inaccessible to his mother. A lifeline for an innocent, woven by the steady hands of his great-grandmother. Amelia, meanwhile, began to rebuild. She sold the cavernous house on Oakhaven Lane, a place that held too many ghosts, and bought a charming townhouse in the city, closer to her design studio. With the financial security Eleanor had given her, she was able to quit her corporate job and focus on her own freelance work, taking on passion projects she'd only dreamed of before. Her art, once a hobby, became her life. She saw Eleanor once a month for lunch. Their bond, forged in the crucible of that awful day, had deepened into a genuine friendship. They talked about art, books, business, and life. Eleanor never spoke of Dylan. It was as if a diseased limb had been amputated to save the body. One afternoon, about a year after the baby shower, Amelia received a package. Inside was a small, beautifully crafted wooden box. She opened it to find a set of exquisite, handcrafted knitting needles made of rosewood and silver. The attached card was written in Eleanor's elegant script. It read, "For the next beautiful thing you will make. Keep weaving, my dear. Your life is your own masterpiece." Amelia picked up the needles, their weight feeling perfect and balanced in her hands. She thought of the sunrise-colored blanket, the gift that had been born of such pain. It had been mocked and discarded, but it had also been the catalyst for her liberation. It had been a thread of hope that, when pulled by the right person, had unraveled a web of lies and woven a new future in its place. She went to her yarn basket and pulled out a skein of the brightest, most vibrant blue wool she could find, the color of an endless sky, the color of freedom, and she began to knit. 2 years passed. The sharp edges of betrayal had softened into a dull, distant ache, like the memory of a poorly set bone. Amelia's life had blossomed in ways she could never have imagined when she was Mrs. Dylan Thompson. Her freelance design business, Sunrise Studio, a quiet nod to the blanket that had changed everything, was a resounding success. She had a waiting list of clients who valued her minimalist aesthetic and intuitive understanding of color. The townhouse was her sanctuary, filled with light, art, and the gentle clicking of knitting needles, which had become her primary form of meditation. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. Her heart, which she had thought irrevocably broken, had begun to heal. There was a man, Michael, an architect she'd met through a client. He was kind, patient, and funny, with eyes that held no secrets. Their relationship was a slow, beautiful bloom, built on the solid ground of honesty and mutual respect. He knew her history, and it didn't frighten him. It made him admire her strength. One crisp October evening, Amelia was attending the opening of a new gallery downtown. One of her larger, abstract, textile pieces, a complex woven tapestry of deep blues and brilliant gold, was a featured work. She was standing with Michael, a glass of champagne in her hand, laughing at something he'd said, when she felt a familiar prickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She turned her head slightly, scanning the well-dressed crowd, and then she saw him. Dylan. He was standing near the entrance, looking utterly out of place. The expensive, tailored suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled blazer and trousers that didn't quite match. He was thinner, and the confident, arrogant posture she remembered had been replaced by a weary slump. He wasn't looking at her art. He was looking at her, his expression a tangled mess of regret and awe. Her heart didn't leap. It didn't pound with anger or fear. It just gave a small, tired thud. Michael felt her stiffen. "Amelia, what is it?" "It's my ex-husband," she murmured, not taking her eyes off Dylan. "Do you want to leave?" Michael asked immediately, his hand finding hers. "No," she said, surprised by her own resolve. "No, I'm not running anymore." As if sensing her decision, Dylan began to walk towards them, his steps hesitant. He stopped a few feet away, as if unsure of his right to enter her space. "Amelia," he said. His voice was rougher, quieter than she remembered. "You look amazing. The tapestry is beautiful." "Dylan, what are you doing here?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, merely factual. "My firm did the structural consulting for this building's renovation. I got a pity invite," he said, with a wry, self-deprecating twist of his lips. He worked for a small, local engineering firm now, a junior position he'd been lucky to get. He glanced at Michael, then back at Amelia. When I saw your name on the program, I wanted to see it, to see you." Michael, sensing this was a conversation they needed to have, gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm going to get us a refill. I'll be right back," he said, giving Dylan a cool, polite nod before walking away, a silent gesture of trust that warmed Amelia more than the champagne ever could. Once they were alone, the silence was heavy. "I heard you got remarried," Dylan said finally, breaking it. "No," Amelia replied. "I'm happy. That's enough for now." "Good. That's good. You deserve to be happy." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "Look, Ames, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I've had 2 years to think, to live with what I did. I wake up with it every morning, and I go to sleep with it every night." He finally met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not the blustering coward from the baby shower, but a broken man. "I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "I had everything. A wife who was kind and brilliant and loyal, a family legacy I didn't build but was happy to spend, and I threw it all away because I was weak, because Isabella made me feel powerful and important, and you just made me feel known, and it scared me. I was a coward, and I am so sorry. Not just for the affair, but for that day, for letting them laugh. That was the moment it all came crashing down, the moment I lost my own soul." Amelia listened, and the last embers of her anger finally turned to ash. All that was left was a profound, sad pity for this shell of a man. He hadn't just lost his money, he had lost his way entirely. "I believe you, Dylan," she said, and she meant it. "I hope you find a way to forgive yourself." A flicker of the old Dylan appeared, a desperate hope in his eyes. "Does that mean, could we ever?" "No," she said gently, but with the finality of a closing door. "That part of my life is over. I wish you no ill will, Dylan, but we are strangers now, and I'm happy with the life I've built without you." He nodded, the last bit of hope dying in his eyes. He seemed to shrink before her. "I understand. I had to say it." He turned to leave, then paused. My grandmother. She sends her love. She talks about you all the time. She said you taught her what the name Thompson was really supposed to mean. He walked away and disappeared into the crowd. Michael returned, placing a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. He didn't ask what was said. He just stood beside her, a warm, solid presence. Amelia looked at her tapestry, at the threads of deep, sorrowful blue intertwined with the brilliant, hopeful gold. It was her story, woven into art, a story of pain and recovery, of betrayal and unexpected grace. Dylan's apology hadn't changed anything, but it had been an echo from a past she had finally outrun. The last ripple from a stone thrown long ago had finally reached the shore, and the water was now still. A year later, Amelia received a call from Eleanor's assistant. The matriarch, now in her late 80s, had suffered a minor stroke. She was recovering at home, but had asked to see Amelia specifically. A sense of urgency and sorrow washed over Amelia as she drove to the grand old Thompson estate, a place she hadn't visited since her first years of marriage. She found Eleanor in a sunroom overlooking a magnificent rose garden, seated in a comfortable armchair with a soft lap blanket over her knees. She was paler and more fragile than Amelia had ever seen her, but her blue eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. "Amelia, my dear girl," she said, her voice a little weaker but still full of warmth. She gestured to a chair beside her. "Thank you for coming. There is something I need to attend to, and I find I need your help." "Anything, Eleanor?" Amelia said, taking the older woman's cool, dry hand. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's about the boy. Carter. He's 3 years old now." Amelia's heart gave a little jolt. It was a name she had intentionally pushed to the back of her mind. "As you know, the trust I established for him is airtight," Eleanor continued. "His mother cannot touch it. He will be well cared for, educated, and want for nothing material. But a boy needs more than money. He needs a sense of his own history, a sense of where he comes from. The good parts, at least." She paused, gathering her strength. "I've been thinking a great deal about legacy. What we leave behind. I do not want that boy's only connection to the Thompson name to be his father's weakness or his mother's greed. I want him to know that there was goodness here too, that there was strength and grace." Eleanor's gaze became intense. "I still have it, you know, the blanket." Amelia was stunned. "You do?" "Of course. I retrieved it from your old house myself after Dylan moved out. I couldn't bear the thought of it being lost. It's been kept in a cedar chest all this time." She reached for a small, beautifully carved wooden box on the table beside her and handed it to Amelia. "It belongs with him, but I cannot be the one to give it to him, and I will not have it pass through his mother's hands. It needs to come from a place of purity, from the person who made it." Amelia stared at the box, her mind reeling. "Eleanor, what are you asking? The trustee for the boys' fund, Mr. Henderson, is a good man. He maintains a collection of items for Carter to receive when he turns 18, along with letters explaining his family history. I want you to give him the blanket, and I want you to write a letter explaining what it meant. Not the pain, my dear," she added quickly, seeing the look on Amelia's face. "The hope, the love for an innocent child that you poured into every stitch. I want him to know that before he was even born, someone from his father's family loved him with a pure and selfless heart. It was an enormous thing to ask, to willingly reconnect with the most painful chapter of her life, to reach out to the living symbol of her marriage's destruction. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect the peaceful world she had so carefully constructed, But then she looked at Eleanor, a woman who had wielded her immense power, not for revenge, but for justice and grace. She thought about the blanket, not as an object of her own humiliation, but as she had originally intended it, a shield of warmth and love for a child. To deny the boy that legacy would be to let Isabella and Dylan have the final say. It would let their cruelty be the end of the story. Her own story was about weaving something beautiful out of broken threads. This was the final stitch. "I'll do it," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. 2 weeks later, Amelia sat in the office of Mr. Henderson, a kind-faced man who looked at her with unconcealed respect. Between them on the polished desk sat the plain white box from the baby shower, the sunrise-coloured blanket nestled inside, as soft and hopeful as the day she finished it. Beside it was a letter Amelia had rewritten a dozen times. It didn't mention the party, the laughter, or the betrayal. It simply said, "To Carter. Before you were born, I made this for you. I wanted to wrap you in something made of warmth and hope. Your life is your own story to weave. May you always choose threads of kindness, integrity, and love. You come from a long line of strong and good people. Be one of them." She didn't sign her name. She simply signed it. "A friend of your family." As she left the building, stepping back out into the sunshine, a profound sense of peace settled over her, deeper than any she had felt before. She had not erased her past, but she had transformed it. The pain was no longer a weapon used against her, but a source of strength she had used to extend one final, anonymous act of grace. That evening she went home to her studio. The last rays of sun streamed through the window, illuminating the vibrant blue wool of her current project. She picked up her rosewood needles, the gift from Eleanor, and cast on a new stitch. The pattern ahead was unknown, the design unwritten, and for the first time she felt completely and utterly free. The tapestry of her life was hers and hers alone, and it was going to be magnificent. Amelia's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about enduring mistreatment silently. It's about recognizing your own worth, even when others try to diminish it. The simplest act of love, like a handmade gift, can hold more power than all the money and status in the world. It was a lesson Isabella and Dylan learned the hard way. But more than that, it's a story about the quiet champions in our lives, the ones who see our pain and refuse to let it stand, the Eleanors who step in when we need them most. Justice doesn't always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives with the quiet dignity of a grandmother who knows the difference between price and value. If this story of resilience and unexpected justice moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to help us share it with more people. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more real-life stories that will inspire and empower you. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen kindness triumph over cruelty in such a dramatic way?